So thank you all for joining us here this evening. When Jane and I talked about a book party for Adam, we thought, go to a room, 15, 20 people will show up. Never thought it was such a big hit.
Well, I think there's another reason they're here too, Indra.
No, I think it's just you. They must have thought you were Ryan Gosling or something. But I've known...
Sorry to disappoint. Yeah.
I've known Adam for several years. Adam was my speechwriter at PepsiCo. So I hired him out of the Obama administration. And I can safely say that everything I uttered for the last 3 years was really Adam's words. Now, when we started working together, Adam told me he was working on a book. But a lot of people write books. I didn't think much about it. But about, I'd say 6 months before the book was really published, Adam told me what the book was about. And I have to tell you, I was pretty shook up because I just couldn't understand something like that happening. But more importantly, my motherly instincts went out to Adam, the little boy, who had to go through whatever he did. And for days after Adam told me about the book, I kept thinking about my man, Adam, sitting there in the house waiting for his mom to come out or whatever. I don't want to take away the surprises, but the book moved me in more ways than I expected. And I read it several times because he didn't put a family tree in the book. So I had to create my own family tree. And I found the book totally fascinating. Shocking, surprising, but fascinating. And everybody from Walter Isaacson to Samantha Powers to Michael Beschloss has praised the book. And Doris Kearns Goodwin, the famous Doris Kearns Goodwin, calls it astonishingly beautiful and profoundly moving. And those of you who have read it will agree with Doris Kearns Goodwin. Having read it extensively, I tell you that it is astonishingly beautiful and profoundly moving. So what we're going to do this evening is Adam is going to talk a few minutes about the book, and then I'll ask him a few questions, and then we'll toss it to you to ask questions. So with that, let me turn it over to the wonderful Adam Frankel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, first, thank you for saying that, Indra. When you shared your reaction with me after reading the book, it meant so much to me. When I went to work for Indra at PepsiCo, I most assuredly knew I was getting a boss. I hoped I might be getting a mentor, but I couldn't have imagined I'd be getting a friend, and I'm really grateful to you. I could write a book about everything I've learned from you. We can do another event here about that. But thank you. And I'll share a little about the book, as Indra mentioned, and we can have that conversation. In 2006, shortly before joining the Obama campaign as deputy speechwriter, I learned something that unraveled my entire understanding of who I am. My mother told me that I'm not my dad's biological son. And she didn't come out and offer that information. I figured it out, I pieced it together and confronted her on it. And it's still, 2006 is not that long ago, and so I still remember vividly my reaction. I was very close to my dad and his side of the family, drew a lot of my identity from that and from him and them. And in that moment, I remember looking down at my hands, looking down at my legs, and feeling like I was inhabiting a stranger's body. I spent many hours in front of a mirror in the years to come, feeling like I was looking at a stranger. And in that conversation with my mom, I learned some other things in that initial conversation. I learned that nobody knew about this. I learned that I was virtually alone with it. My dad did not know. In that conversation, I asked my mom, does Dad know? She said, God, no, it would break his heart. It would be in almost 10 years before I told my dad that I'm not his son, before I mustered the courage to do that. I also learned in that conversation that there was one other person who did know, and that was my biological father. I would learn years later that I was not an accident, that I was actually a planned pregnancy, that I was a secret baby that my biological father and my mother decided to have. In that moment, after learning all of this, needless to say, I was shaken. I was also filled with anger at the secrecy all of this, what it meant. I was living at home where the apartment I'd grown up in New York City after working on the Kerry campaign in 2004. I moved out of the apartment, moved in with my girlfriend. I just didn't want to be around my mom at that time, and she has struggled with mental health issues over the course of her life. She had, and my withdrawal from her prompted an episode where she called me up, and it's still hard for me to even picture and think about my mom in this state, but she called me up and begged me to come over, and I was not, we were not in great terms, so I was wary to do so, but I could sense something was wrong, and so I did, and I was really worried about her, so I, with her brother, rushed her to a psychiatric emergency room, and she had a history of this. I mean, before I was born, she was hospitalized for a suicide attempt. So months after learning all of this, I went to see a therapist with my mother. She begged, she was trying to repair our relationship. And on the way out of a therapist's office, I got a call from a friend of mine from the Kerry campaign, a guy named John Favreau, who at that time was writing speeches for Barack Obama in the Senate. And Fav said, "You want to be my deputy on the Obama campaign?" I'm like literally walking out of a therapist's office when he says, I'm thinking to myself, are you kidding? Get me out of New York. I'll do anything. Get me, and I, you know, desperate to work on the Obama campaign, but also eager to get out of New York at that time. And for the next almost 5 years or so, I buried all this. I couldn't deal with it. It's too much. I just wanted to be as good a speechwriter for Barack Obama as I was capable of being. And the thing is, it turns out if you are trying to not deal with personal issues, working on a presidential campaign is actually very convenient. Because there's a lot of stuff to do. You're very busy. You don't have time. And so it was only in the White House that I started grappling with some of this. It may be hard to imagine now, but actually the White House can be a relatively stable environment compared to a presidential campaign. In past, it has been. You know. And it was really only there that I started grappling with this, and frankly had an identity crisis when I did start grappling with this, and left the White House, ended up moving back to New York, and started trying to piece together what had happened. Beginning to ask my mom more questions about this, trying to understand what happened. I reached out to my biological father, tried to understand from his perspective all this stuff, what had happened. And over the course of trying to piece it together, what I came to feel and believe was that the way this would make sense to me was not just by going back to my mom and understanding her life and her experience, but going back to her parents and understanding my family's larger story. Her parents were Holocaust survivors. Some of you may have been patrons at my grandfather's watch repair shop, Parisman Jewelers, which was on Whaley Avenue in New Haven. Up until practically the day he died a couple years ago, at the age of 94 or so. And my grandfather was at a number of Nazi camps, ending the war at Dachau, where he was a slave laborer on a project personally approved by Hitler to essentially move the German aviation industry underground. It was being decimated by Allied bombing, and he was one of 10,000 Jews re-imported into the Reich when it was Judenrein, to build these massive airplane manufacturing facilities. I asked him when I was young, what did you do when you were at Dachau? And he said, oh, I built an underground airport. I said, what does that mean? That doesn't make any sense. I figured he was kind of losing his marbles or something was getting lost in translation. I should have taken him at his word. He was virtually exactly right. My grandmother spent much of the war in the woods of Eastern Europe. Her brothers, with her two brothers, as working and fighting alongside Russian partisans, Jewish resistance. Her parents were murdered. Her 3 sisters were killed. 2 of her sisters had families of their own who were killed. When I was young, my grandmother would be in the kitchen making me freshly squeezed orange juice in the mornings whenever I'd sleep over. And I thought, oh, my grandmother, my bubby loves me so much. She's waking up early, you know, just for me. Her Shana Engela, as she would say in Yiddish. She never slept through the night all her life because of the nightmares that kept her awake. She would tear up when I would ask her about it even then, so everyone in the family didn't really ask her a lot, but the fragments I got, she remembered hiding in the walls of her home while Nazis stuck bayonets into the walls. She remembers looking through the walls while the Nazis ran up the staircase looking for her and her family, horrific stories. And so I started to reflect on this history. And I'd always known, many of you may come from Holocaust survivor families. We know that this has a major impact on our life stories. I knew that. I didn't fully understand how, but I sensed it did. And in recent years, there's been fascinating research about intergenerational trauma. And as I started looking into that research, I began to feel like I was understanding my family's story a little better. And so as I said about writing this book, I went and talked to some of the leading experts in this stuff. I talked to people like Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai, who has done groundbreaking work in the emerging science of epigenetics. The epigenome is a layer of information that sits on top of the gene and is subject to external factors, including chronic stress and trauma. And what Rachel has found is that children of Holocaust survivors are 3 times as likely to display PTSD when confronted by a traumatic event as demographically similar Jews who are not children of survivors. She's found that children of women who were pregnant at or near ground zero on 9/11 displayed similarly low levels of a stress hormone called cortisol, which is associated with PTSD, as their mothers. Other research backs this up. I interviewed people like Yael Danieli, who's looked at the way that that Holocaust survivors and how they responded to their experiences affected the likelihood that their children might develop mental health issues. She sort of classified Holocaust survivor families into a bunch of different categories of victim families or fighter families who were trying to counteract the notion of the victimized Jew, and other sort of families, and showed that depending on where you fit, maybe your children might be more likely to display various mental health issues. And so there's a lot of research on this stuff. Some of it's mixed, some of it shows a lot of real results and effects across generations, some of it doesn't. But looking at that research, talking to folks, trying to understand the legacy of intergenerational trauma helped me understand my family's story, and it helped me forgive my mother and make peace, and it helped me move on. And that's a big part of why I wrote the book. I wrote the book for my and my family's sake, as a way of processing all of this. I'm a writer, and it helped me do that. I wrote it for other people in the hopes that it would help them too. There's an explosion of family disclosures with 23andMe and Ancestry.com. These sort of disclosures are happening all the time. There's not a clear path for people to follow. I know because when I had this disclosure, I didn't have anywhere to turn. I was looking. I was trying to find people who had something similar. It's very hard to find that. And I hope this book offers a path, an example of what that can look like for people. I get emails now from people who've read the book. Just this week, I got an email from someone who said that they bought a 23andMe kit for fun, and it upended their entire life. I get emotional time out of this. And they found that it was just cathartic reading the book, because they like me, didn't know it was such a confusing revelation. And more broadly, everybody has trauma in their life or their family's life somewhere. And for many of us Jews, it may be Holocaust trauma or other forms of trauma, but many other folks, whether it's addiction, abuse, racism, any number of other things. And at least in my case, understanding the nature of intergenerational trauma helped me understand that there may be such a thing as intergenerational healing too, and that maybe if we confront some of this stuff, we can move forward, that it's not just about some of the negative stuff that we may get from those who came before us, but also some of the positive stuff, the strength and resilience. And that is what I hope people take away from the book as well, that it is in the end, a hopeful story, as much as a painful one. So that's a brief overview, but I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Indra.
It's emotional listening to what you have to say. Let me ask you a question. You wrote the book. Has it brought the family together, or has it divided you all even more? While I was working on this book, I dreaded my parents reading it, for obvious but different reasons. My dad was very wary about this book. Frankly, my dad came closer to asking me not to write it than my mother did. It troubled him, but both of them over time came to understand how important it was to
me to just to purge this experience. I got a call from my mother's brother after it came out, who read it in tears and said that he thought and hoped it would be good for the family. We'll see. I think that as I write in the book, my mother's family, has there have been some difficulties with them over the course of this whole journey, and that's continued to play itself out. My dad's side has been incredibly supportive, so I think that kind of the way that they handled the whole experience years ago has continued to play itself out now that the book is out. Half the family's been very supportive, and the other half less so.
So you write in the book that even before your mother told you about the truth of your birth, you had some doubts about your ancestry. So tell us a little bit about that. Why did you have suspicions?
Well, I look nothing like my dad. And growing up, I'd go up to the mirror occasionally and kind of look for, like I think a lot of adolescents may do, where do I get from this family member that? And I'd sometimes say, oh, maybe I do look like my dad. Occasionally someone would say I look like my dad, and I'd feel such excitement, relief almost, in retrospect. But I didn't have burning doubts. I mean, I think some people do. I did not. Denial is a powerful thing. It turns out I'm a spitting image of my biological father, who was a presence in my life growing up, whom I know. But I never was able or willing to connect those dots. But it wasn't these doubts that kind of led me to begin asking my mother about all this. It was innocuous questions. I was living at home. There was a lot of unstructured time. And I was just trying to fill in missing pieces in my family history, asking about why my parents separated when I was young. And I could tell that the questions made my mom very uncomfortable. And it was really only her response to my questions that I started pulling on the thread and getting answers that, I asked him. I went to my dad, and
tell us about the moment in which you told your dad about.
Well, yeah. So I can share that. So after about 8 years of carrying this secret, through the White House. Look, on the Obama campaign, I didn't tell anybody about this. I sat. The speechwriters sat, a couple of feet from each other. We all were in close quarters for years, and when we weren't at work, we were all hanging out together. Never told any of them, kept all this to myself. And even after I left, I couldn't bring myself to tell. And part of the reason, by the way, I couldn't tell anybody was it didn't feel right to tell anybody if my dad didn't know. It just felt like it was so profoundly personal. How could I tell anybody about this if my own dad didn't know? But ultimately, I realized that I needed to. It was the only way through it. The whole experience had caused such pain and disruption in my life that it was the only way to move forward was to have a conversation with him. So I called him up and I said, I'd like to come see you. And he said, what's it about? And I said, I'd rather not get into it on the phone. And he said, well, now you're making me worried. So I went up and saw him in Hastings, where he lives. And he picked me up from the train station, and I started getting choked up in the car, but I didn't want to get into it in the car. So we get back to his house, and he's happily remarried, and his wife had my stepmother had given us some time alone. And I launch into it. I say, remember some years ago when I told you that I had taken Mom to a psychiatric ER? He said, yes. I said, well, what I didn't tell you was the reason I took her to an ER was because she had a break because I had stopped talking to her. And the reason I'd stopped talking to her was that she told me that I use the name Jason Black in the book. I'm Jason Black's biological son. And I couldn't get the words out. I'm bawling at this point. And as I'm saying this, through my tears, I hear him say, I know. Mm-hmm. And I didn't think I was hearing him right. What do you mean you know? And he said, Adam, I've always known it was possible. But I made a decision a long time ago that you're my son no matter what, and you always will be. And I went up and gave him a huge hug. And then he said, is that all? Is that all you wanted to talk about? You knew how to lighten the mood. And then he shared with me, his doubts over the years because we didn't look. He'd had various doubts. And at one point, during a legal conflict with my mom when I was young, he considered getting a paternity test done, but had decided against it. And later on I learned, when my dad still hadn't even told his siblings about my identity, when the book was about to come out, it was only after a description of the book was being put online that he decided to tell his siblings. And he called his sister and shared it with her first, and she took in the information, called him back a few hours later and said, Steve, who's my dad, Steve, you're not going to believe this, but 30 years ago, their dad, my grandfather, who I was very close to, he was the reason I wanted to be a speechwriter. My grandfather was a speechwriter to Hubert Humphrey and Adlai Stevenson, and he wrote some speeches for all these kind of Robert Kennedy, all these kind of folks. My grandfather took my aunt aside when my dad wasn't around and said, it's possible Adam is not Steve's son. But it doesn't matter at all. He's my other grandson. He's my grandson. He's my other child. And I'll always adore every step he takes. And I was floored hearing this. But it just showed because by the way, I feel very lucky. I think a lot of people who have these sorts of revelations don't get the kind of resolution that I've been able to get. But I was floored because I didn't think I would get resolution on that aspect of it. I was very close to them. And I just, broke down on a Brooklyn street when my dad called me to tell me all of this. But that's a long answer to that question.
No, this is the right answer. So you now call your biological father.
Yeah.
And tell us how that whole thing evolved. How did you meet him? What was your reaction? What was his reaction?
So I've known him all my life. He was a presence in my life growing up. He was one of my mother's professors in graduate school. We would, when I was young, spend time together as families. At the Democratic National Convention in 2000 in LA, I volunteered, and I spent the week at the home of my half-sister. Neither of us knew we were related. On another trip to LA, where... Even
though you looked like your biological dad.
Yeah. On another trip to LA when I was young, I'd stayed with a woman who it turns out was my paternal grandmother, who I did not know was my paternal grandmother. It turns out she knew I was her grandson. So when I reached out to Jason, as I call him, initially just to get a paternity test and family history. My wife and I were thinking of having kids, and I wanted to get some details and figured after all the disruption I needed to know with certainty whether he was my biological father. So we started having these, these lunches, always at his insistence at the Carlisle in New York. That's like where we would have these conversations, and over the course of these conversations, I got a clear picture of him. On one of those occasions, he said, you were wanted. I said, what do you mean it was wanted? And he said, you weren't in an accident. Your mother and I wanted to have you. So I go back to my mom and I say, Jason said I was wanted. What's that all about?
And your mother was married to your father at that time?
My mother was married to my father at the time. Jason was married and had a family of his own at the time. My mom says, well, I wouldn't say it was my idea. Okay. Let's process that information. Each of these is like, is this my life? Okay, this is my life. Here we go. So I take this back to Jason. And I say, my mom says this was your idea. Why did you want to have me? And my mother, and Jason looks at me and he says, rather nonchalantly, I should say, well, the idea of having a secret baby appealed to my sense of mystery and the erotic. Okay? This is what he says to me. In one of those same conversations, he also said to me that he was attracted to my mother because he was attracted to broken women. This was 2 years, their affair began 2 years after my mother was hospitalized for a suicide attempt. So I gained a very clear picture of him, I think, over the course of those conversations, even though I'd known him in some way all my life. I mean, he helped pay for my bar mitzvah. He helped, and there are all kinds of things in retrospect that I see. It's sort of like a shadow biography of me emerged over the course of this whole crazy process. But that lunch where he shared some of those things with me was the last time that I communicated with him.
Does your mother communicate with him?
You know, I share in the book some of what my mother told me about how her relationship with him began, which was ugly. And my mother, basically, my mother shared with me that after she shared that with me, after she told me and revisited herself how that relationship began, that it changed her whole perspective on her relationship with him, because she hadn't thought about it in so long. And she has said to me that she has not been in touch with him since, because they've been friends, you know, since all of this. They had a years-long affair, and their friendship continued until very recently. But she said that conversation with me, where she started revisiting this and sharing with me some of the ugliness of how their relationship began when she was his student, put an end to that relationship.
So let me ask you a bit of a technical question, Adam.
Yeah.
So there was a story unveiling about who you were. How did you make the connection with that and intergenerational Holocaust issues? How did you make that?
You know, it's not a one-to-one, and I wouldn't claim that it is. And the truth, you know, look, the truth is, this whole book and process of writing the book was my best effort to wrap my head around this crazy disclosure that when you're 25, you learn you're not who you thought you were, and it's just this crazy story. And I was trying to make sense of it. And this was my way of trying to understand it. But it's not one-to-one. I think that, but there's no doubt in my mind that my grandparents' Holocaust experience affected my mother in profound ways that were negative. I think that...
Give me an example.
Sure, sure. So apart from some of the scientific research, which is admittedly new and uneven, and I wouldn't claim otherwise, which may have contributed to some of her mental health stuff, there's broader stuff. I mean, I think that, look, our family, I think this is common to a lot of Holocaust survivor families, and many others, I should say, but our family kept a lot of secrets. You know, my middle name, my mother's name, the name that was on my grandfather's watch repair shop in New Haven, Parisman Jewelers, was not my grandfather's name. It was a name that he bought or acquired somehow in a DP camp after the war, because he was selling some stuff on the black market. The West German police were after him, and he was afraid he wouldn't be able to come to this country under that name, so he bought somebody's name. He and my grandmother remarried under these assumed names. Growing up, my mother and the whole family knew they could never share this. They were terrified because there were a lot of German reparations on the line with that name. He was getting a lot of money from the German government. And my mother herself says, you know, at one point when I said to my mom, when we had a sort of heated conversation about her keeping this a secret, because at a certain point it wasn't for me to forgive the affair and the betrayal to my dad. That was for my dad to deal with. But the secrecy was really the lies to me. It was part of what bothered me the most. She said, well, what do you expect? I was raised to keep the secret of our name. So she felt that, and I believe that culture of secrecy contributed to some of this. I think that also in our family, there was and I think this is true of many Holocaust survivor families, not unique to Holocaust survivor families, but there was a projection of strength, an insistence on projecting strength and dignity to the outside world, and not letting anybody perceive any weakness among the family, because, you know, in a concentration, we have endless stories from our family, as many of your families may, of any sign of weakness being a matter of life and death in the camps. And that, I think, contributed to my grandparents' inability or unwillingness to deal with my mom's mental health issues when she was young. I mean, after her suicide attempt, they never spoke about it. I asked my mom, did you ever, they came to get her in the hospital, did you ever talk about it? She said no, which I can't even wrap my head around that. So I think there were certain ways in which the survival skills that were skills that were so necessary for my grandparents to survive the war became actually maladaptive in a peacetime setting with my mother's generation. So some of the patterns of behavior that were so indispensable for them, they passed on these behaviors to their family, and they had negative repercussions in a very different setting. So those are some of the ways I think that it played itself out.
It's interesting. I don't know how many of you have read the book, but when I read the book, and I mentioned this to Adam right after I read it, even though your mother had these secrets and she hid them from you and you were upset, you treated your mother very gently in the book. You explained that she had the mental illnesses and you're sorry that she had those illnesses and she struggled through it, but never once do you sort of absolutely dump on her.
Yeah.
It was interesting because you talked about being angry with your mother, but you treat her very well.
I'm happy to hear. I'm happy to hear you say. I tried. I wanted to be fair. It was not, that was important to me. She's a complicated woman, and she's an incredible woman in many respects. And I think that understanding that complexity is an important piece of understanding the way that trauma can play itself out.
And you're in touch with her now, still?
Oh yes. The irony of some of this is some of her family is very upset with me. Our relationship is very good. She's been supportive of the book, and frankly, from my perspective, it's opened up a dialogue with us because there's so much that I felt upset about. And as she's read the book, I have nothing more to say to her about this subject. I wrote a book about it. There's literally nothing else that I have to share with her about it, and that kind of took a big load off of my shoulders. And so I feel like it liberated me in a way, and our relationship is very good.
And when did you write this book? Some people say you wrote it on your way to PepsiCo every day. How did that work?
I did write it on. I had a commute from Brooklyn, New York. I drove out to Purchase, which on average is an hour and 15 minutes, I'd say, sometimes longer. And I dictated much of the book on my phone, on the audio to text feature during the commute, and then I'd email it to myself. And we got young kids. It's hard to find the time to write a book. And the hardest part for me is getting the initial idea down. And then during a few hours here and there, you can edit and refine and stuff. But yeah, I dictated much of the first draft on that commute. So
because you never missed a beat supporting me. And when did you tell President Obama about the book, and what was his reaction?
So I probably about a little over a year ago now or so, I swung by President Obama's personal offices in DC, and I was talking to a friend of mine who was on his staff, and he walked by the hallway and heard my voice and popped in, and he said, "What are you up to?" That's my Obama voice. What are you up to? And I said, "Well, I'm writing. I'm working on a book." He said, "Oh, what's it about?" And I was like, all right, here we go. Here we go. You asked. So I share all of this with him, and it was very moving because our relationship when I worked on his staff is all business. There was work to be done. I was 95% of every conversation we ever had was about a speech. And this was very different. He was very empathetic, and it meant a lot to me. When I told him I was writing about intergenerational trauma, he said, "Sounds like a real beach read," which I thought was a great reaction. And then he said, when I told him about the paternity stuff, he kept saying, "How'd you figure it out? Is your dad black?" I was like, that's too good a line. I'm going to put that in the book. But he was very warm and supportive. Yeah.
That's great. Any broader lessons from the book for all of us, Adam?
Everyone manages issues and trauma in their lives in their own ways. All of these are unique kind of circumstances. I do think that in my case, I felt I needed to just face it, and that was my way forward. There is extraordinary power in writing about traumatic experiences, not just for writers. There is a research, widely credible research that's used with veterans and many other groups of folks who have experienced profound trauma, about the physical health benefits of writing, about thoughts that are weighing on us. And it's called expressive writing. There's a whole technique around it, pioneered by a professor at UT Austin. And I mean, one study has shown that it can mitigate the symptoms of certain forms of cancer. And so I think that that is one lesson that I think that I found in writing this that I think is broadly applicable.
The incredible Adam Frankel.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you, Indra. Thank you.
So with that, we'll take your questions. Given the circumstances of your birth and the secret, how would you envision the ideal way that your mother could have told you the truth?
Mm-hmm. I've thought a lot about that. Look, where I've come down on that is that there is never a good time to share information like this. There never would have been an easy time to have that conversation. There are only better times and worse times. And fundamentally, from my perspective, I had a right to the information. So at a fundamental level, she had an obligation to tell me. The question of when is sensitive. Had it been too early, my dad could have walked away, understandably. And it would have been painful and disruptive whenever. I think that, so I think where I've landed is that maybe, you know, when I was in college, at some point, maybe in my early 20s, I think the larger problem I have with it was that she never intended to tell me. Mm-hmm. That she said that to me, that she said that she had no intention of ever telling me. And that was what was very hard for me. I think that, you know, even if when I confronted her about it, she had said, you know, here are my reasons that I hadn't told you, but I did intend to tell you. I was trying to muster the courage. Even if she'd done that, I'd trying to muster the courage or been upfront about it and expressed a willingness and grappling with that. But she didn't grapple with it. She had decided that she was never going to tell me. And that was, that I think is not okay. From my perspective, I felt and feel strongly about that.
Does she feel she should have told you now in retrospect?
I don't know. I don't know. I've asked her. I think that she understands how painful this whole experience was for me. But I don't know. I bet a part of her still thinks, you know, if only he hadn't figured it out, you know, or asked, and I don't know. I don't know if I'm not sure.
Your biological father's identity is kept confidential. Is that to protect his family? And if so, do you feel any obligation to share his secret with your half-siblings?
The truth is, it's not to protect him. It's to protect me and our family. Because my mother says certain things about him in the book, and I write certain things, all of which are true. But you know, I made a decision after discussing it with our publisher and others that it made all the sense in the world to change his name and the names of his family members. Again, it's less. I feel I started wanting to put it in there. I had a very heated conversation with the publisher about it, actually, because the whole point of the book is honesty, and I very much wanted to be transparent about it. But you know, I'm not looking to extend the drama of this thing anymore in my life and my family's life. And I felt like if I did that, it might. As far as the rest of his family, I've had. You know, as I say, I've known them my whole life. I've had a conversation with my half-brother about all of this. He's aware of it, who's a bit older than I am. To the best of my knowledge, my half-sister does not know.
Does his wife know?
His current wife knows. The woman he was married to at the time of the affair, to the best of my knowledge, does not know. She may now. I think I have an aunt on that side who's alive who doesn't know about me. I think the rest of his family, they may know. They may know now. I'm half expecting to come to an event and somebody to raise their hand and say they're my uncle. But you know, I think those conversations, I expect some of those conversations will happen at some point, but they haven't happened yet.
This is an interesting one. It says, you describe family idiosyncrasies like not discussing family matters or not trusting outsiders that are typical of Holocaust survivors. But how did you make the leap from thinking that this behavior was just my family to understanding that the trauma of the Holocaust has been passed down to the children, to your mother in particular? It's not, you know, I guess as I say, it's not. I don't think of it as one-to-one. I just know from everything, from my entire, everything I know about my mom and my grandparents and our whole family, that my mother's whole life has unfolded in ways that I feel like are a result of her parents' Holocaust experience, and that. In all of these ways, whether it was
some of the behaviors which I write about in the book of Holocaust survivor families, whether it's in some of the science of the way that mental health issues, depression, potentially borderline personality disorder, which I also write about with respect to my mother, can emerge in Holocaust survivor families, some of this stuff. That helped me understand some of my mom's upbringing. It helped me empathize with my mother. It was a way for me to understand my family's journey. But that's the best I can offer, I think, in response to that. I don't know for sure. I don't know that it is it's possible that there are many other reasons for my mother's life to have unfolded the way it has and for this to have emerged.
Here's another good one. Both of your grandfathers had very different experiences in World War II. In writing the book, did you discover any similarities in how they approached their lives after the war? Did Grandpa Frankel ever discuss what he witnessed in the Pacific?
Grandpa Frankel wrote a book called Frankly Speaking about the South Pacific. Man of wordplay. He is a great writer, better writer than I am. So I grew up on his stories. He was an infantry officer in the South Pacific, and I grew up on his stories. I think interestingly, and this is probably common, I would suspect, to many of your families, by the time I came around, look, my grandfather, my Zeta, my mom's dad, didn't talk about the war for much of his life, but by the time I came around, he talked very openly about it. My dad's dad, my pa, as I called him, the South Pacific guy, talked about it all the time. He'd tell me all these stories, always with the happy endings, the moral. He'd kind of make these horrific stories sort of funny for a kid. But I still remember when Saving Private Ryan came out, I said, Pa, let's go see Saving Private Ryan. And I just assumed he'd say, jump at it, because he talked about the war all the time. He wrote a book about, all the time he'd talk about his war stories. And I remember he got very serious, and he said, I can't go see that movie. It's going to bring back too much. So I think even for both of my grandparents in their own ways, they tried to process it. They both tried to talk about it and did talk about it a lot. But the trauma of the experience, how could it have been fully purged? It was too much. It stayed with them.
Here's an unusual question. Do you think your mother's conception of you outside of your parents' marriage was an attempt to protect you from an unknown danger?
I don't know. Maybe. I do know that, my mother, and I know this because my mother, I interviewed some of my mom's closest friends as I wrote the book from that time. My mom confided in at least one of her close friends at the time about me. And she was terrified that people would find out. And she told this friend that she knew that that Jason would be a terrible father. And so that was why she wanted to stay married to my dad. That is why she wanted to keep the secret. So in that sense, she felt like she was protecting me. I should also say that there was another pregnancy after me between my mother and Jason that didn't come to term. So, they actually, as best I understand it, were trying to deceive my dad into raising multiple ones of this guy's kid. It just adds another dimension to the. And the truth of the matter is, over the course of writing this book, I had this notion, this rather idealistic, naive notion that the truth shall set you free. That if I can just figure out the truth, I'll feel at peace. But as I acquired this information and more and more, I mean, even now I can't wrap my head around some of this stuff. And that's okay. I'm okay. I don't need to probe any further,
But Adam, given that you look like Jason, did you feel like, do you ever feel that other people knew all along and never told you? And why do you think they didn't notice the resemblance?
I think some people, I think there were, so some of my mom's friends knew, both the ones my mother confided in and a couple others, I think, who knew Jason and knew my mom. I think my pa, the South Pacific guy, and my grandmother, who I was also very close to on that side, I think they knew, partly because of the resemblance. And they knew Jason too, because he would show up at birthday parties, you know, when I was young. So I do think that there were people who didn't. In fact, one of my mom's friends said to me when I called her up about the book, she apologized to me. She said, I never felt it was my place to say anything, and I'm sorry. And I don't feel like she owed me an apology, but I think it just shows the way that these secrets can linger. I mean, this was 30 years ago, almost 40 years, Frank, and that had haunted her, that she knew this, she could tell, and she knew that I was in the dark. And it haunted her all these years. She said, I've been waiting for this call.
Adam, there are 3 questions about your parenting styles, but let me read them and then you decide how you want to answer them. It says, you carry a lot of responsibility from the time you were a little boy. Does that influence your approach to parenting? And how do you avoid passing on your own trauma? And along with that says, you state you have 2 children. When will you share the story with them? And the last one is, how has this experience influenced how you are as a husband and a father? So find a way to wrap them all and answer them. He can do it. If anybody can do it, is...
A big part of the reason I wrote the book, look, a big part of the reason I wrote the book is to make my best effort at stopping this stuff from being passed on to another generation, best I could at least, you know, make as valiant an effort as I could. You know, thankfully I have an incredible wife who's very grounded and insisted, and is the reason that I initially confronted this when we were dating. And I confided in her about this in the White House. She said, you can't hide from this anymore. You need to deal with it. And that's her approach to everything, is just facing it. And I think that that is an important part of how we act as parents. You know, I was playing a matching game with our daughter who turns 4 next month the other day. And there was a tree. And I said, you know, there's a tree there. And she said, where is it? And I said, I'm not going to tell you. You got to find the tree yourself. And she said, that's a secret, Daddy. In our family, we have no secrets. So I think we're doing good. I think we're doing a good job on the no secrets front. I think that principle is getting across. There may be others we need to work on, but that one's okay.
So here's one. What type of professor was Jason? And do you think he did this with other students?
You know, I'm not going to answer the first question because I do go to lengths to protect his identity, and I don't want to, you know, undo that here.
Just tell a little bit.
I do suspect that he did this with. I mean, I put it this way. I suspect that had I used his real name, I would have heard from other families. You know, I mean, he would say to me things like, you know, many women came up to me over the years and asked me to be fathers of their children. You know, he would say that, and about students. And I think at one point I asked him whether I had any other children, and he kind of smiled a little bit, but said no. But you know, who knows? I think it would not surprise me.
So let me ask you a question then, Adam. Don't you owe it to everybody to publicly talk about him?
You know, the truth is, if I didn't think that there was the potential of a lawsuit from him against me.
For doing what?
Well, part of what my mother shares about the way their relationship began is ugly and not fully consensual. And in this climate, you know, that can be this source of a lawsuit. And I don't want to deal with that. I don't want, as I say, like, I'm ready to move on. I'm not looking to extend this. And so maybe I do. But I made a compromise. I made a choice, and from our family, that we don't need that. So that's the reason that I don't disclose his name.
Do you worry about inheriting any of Jason's traits?
I mean, I'm sure I've inherited some of his traits. I mean, that's, you know, part of the. Of course, I worry about it. I'm like a test case in nature versus nurture. You know, my half brother said to me, you know, he said, from his perspective, he said, "You got the best of both worlds. You know, you got my dad's, you know, brains, as he put it, but you didn't have to have him as your dad." You know, and So I suspect I do have a lot of, but thank God I was raised by my dad, and thank God I have the dad that I do, because he and his whole family have been stabilizing, nurturing, loving influences on me, and they still are to this day.
I'm a child of, this person writes, I'm a child of survivors. My parents didn't talk about it, so I didn't know as a child. But I felt terrible sadness at home. Did you feel that at home?
By the time I came around, the family did talk about it. But I know in my own family's experience that I think it's a profoundly difficult experience to grow up with in a Holocaust survivor family. I mean, I'm sure there are many different types of Holocaust survivor families, and I'm not trying to make an overgeneralization here, but it's not easy for the kids. I mean, as a third generation, I have it much easier, I think, compared to the second generation. You grow up in a household where there's always, in some families, there were your parents had whole families that were killed, and you're a second family that's being started after the war. All of my mother and her whole siblings were named after my grandparents' siblings and parents who were murdered just 10 years before. I mean, these days we name people after relatives who've passed away, but it's a peacetime, someone passes after a long illness. My whole family was named after murdered relatives who died within a decade of when they were born. I can't imagine, did my grandfather ever look at my mom, who's named after his own mother who died, without thinking of his mom? I ask myself these questions. And as a child, I know because I've talked to my mom at length and her siblings about this, I think a lot of people felt a lot of pressure to be good, to not put anything on their parents. Their parents had been through enough, so they didn't want to complain about anything. They no pain, no disappointment was ever, worth talking about, because their parents were Holocaust survivors. What could possibly be worth, laying at their feet? And one understands that inclination. I think that's a very reasonable thing to feel, but it's problematic for healthy, well-adjusted people for people to grow up healthy and well-adjusted. I think to feel wary about having a full range of emotions around their parents. I think I certainly saw that in our family. And there was a pain, there was a sadness that just kind of lingered over the home. My uncle would tell me about waking up when he was a kid, as my grandmother screamed her sister's names in the middle of the night. This stuff, you can't escape it. And there's also a weird thing about common to a lot of Holocaust survivor families, including ours, where the doors are never locked in the house. You can always enter any room at any time. There's a lack of boundaries. There's a lot of families, these families are described as enmeshed, where, in a family that is very sensitive to loss, anything that can be perceived as separation from the family is clamped down on. And so parents can be overly determinative in terms of their children's development and everything, and the kids stay very close to the family in ways that sometimes are not healthy. And that all played itself out in my family as well.
Here's a good one, Adam. Why did you wait 12 years to go to the rabbi after you learned of the secret? Right after you went to a therapist, you also say from Obama, "Faith gives me peace." I wonder if you would not have been as tormented and lonely and you reached out to your rabbi earlier, because God gives us unexpected gifts.
I feel sure that is true. I think the only answer I can give to that is that I wasn't capable of doing that. I wasn't capable of going to anybody with this for many years. I think that my biggest regret in how I handled the whole thing is keeping it inside for as long as I did. If I'd just talked to my dad about it sooner, and talked to my rabbi, talked to friends, and there would have been a huge support network. As I've talked to my Obama friends, who I was so close to, I taped David Axelrod's podcast the other week, and Ax said, "I wish you told me. I wish I could have been there for you. I wish I'd told him too. I wish I'd told all of them." There was a whole support network of friends and some family who would have been ready to be there, and a rabbi and any number of others. And And that was, I think, in retrospect, and maybe that's a lesson as well for others. It's certainly one that I would impart to anybody who's willing to listen, that keeping it in was the most detrimental thing that I could have done, and that had I been willing to share it, it would have eased a lot of heartache a lot faster.
So do you think if someone has such information about a friend, they should share it?
That is a sensitive question. I think that if somebody has such information about a friend, that friend has a right to that information. But how that information is shared, it needs to be done very sensitively. There is a story that I've come across of a guy. There's a podcast called Family Secrets that's run by a woman named Dani Shapiro. And she had a guest on her show who was raised by what he thought was his adoptive family. It turns out his older sister in this adopted family was actually his mother. And the entire town knew. The entire town knew, and when he was graduating from high school, his two friends said to him, "The whole town knows this truth. It's time that we tell you."
I have a last question, Adam.
Yeah.
Personal question.
Yeah.
Listening to you talk in the opening comments, it was very emotional. Have you broken down in any book meeting, and have you had trouble completing your comments?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. It's a wonder to me sometimes when I get through it without crying. Some of the stuff is still very raw. It's also very raw as I've gone around and talked about the book, what people share, because the book is so personal and so open that people share a lot with me. And so people, both survivor families, second generation people and others, people who've dealt with mental health issues in their families, depression, borderline personality disorder, any number of things. And then these family disclosures and families who are maybe they're grappling with issues related to adoption. One woman came up to me and said that her adopted daughter has reached out to the birth family, and it's creating some issues, and she's trying to grapple with it. And so a lot of these conversations become very emotional for me and others as we talk about some of this stuff. So, but a little less so with every one of the conversations, I think.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Adam Frankel.
Thank you. Thank you, Indra. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.